Good morning slash afternoon. I'm Jeff Heilman. And today I'm going to be talking about blastFoam. So I guess blastFoam was developed at Synthetic Technologies, and I'm just going to give you guys a little bit of information on sorry, 1 second. A little bit of background on Synthetic. So we started in 2017. We're a small startup company. We are based out of the Capital Factory in Austin, Texas. So we're close to a lot of government clients as well as other integrators, small startups, that kind of thing. We have partnerships with University of South Dakota, their HPC specifically, which is where we run all of our big jobs. And then, so in addition to blastFoam, which is really just a small part of the company, we also do a lot of machine learning, city core, deep view, a couple of other projects that we work on. And then we do work for commercial as well as federal clients, and really we focus on applied research projects. There we go. So the blastFoam development team, I'm Jeff Heilman. I got my PhD in mechanical engineering from Iowa State in 2019. And I have been the lead developer of the blastFoam toolbox, CFD solver, whatever you want to call it. My primary research has been in multi-phase flows. So my PhD was in bubbly flows and gas solid flows, as well as quadrature-based moment methods. And then obviously since then, I've done a lot of very compressible multi-phase flows. We have Ben Shields, who recently joined the team, got his PhD in CFD from University of Champaign-Urbana. Next, we have Peter Vonk, who did the initial implementation of blastFoam way back when. And then Tim Brewer, who technical army officer and did a lot of modeling and simulation specifically to support weapon development and kind of protective design programs. Okay, so here are just some quick examples. So we have some Taylor-Richtmeyer instabilities on the top left, so kind of a DNS type simulation. Really looking at those instabilities that form on the surface of the high density gradients. Some looking at loads on structures or non-standard structures. So here an aircraft wing behind a blast ball. Next, we're actually looking at loading on structures. We did this in collaboration with a couple of groups, where they then used our loads to look at the structural response of the buildings. And then lastly, we do a lot of cityscape simulation, so looking at damages caused by detonations going off in cities. Yeah. Okay, so today's topics kind of go a little bit over blastFoam, where it's been, where it's going, that kind of thing. We're going to look at the solved equations specifically for the standard blastFoam solver. We have a couple different things that we won't really be talking about. I'll mention them briefly, but won't go into too much detail. Kind of go through a little bit of the structure of blastFoam. So if you're interested in using some of the tools that are in there, or developing some new systems that you want to solve, hopefully it'll help with that. And then some additional features that we've added, kind of like utilities, that kind of stuff. And then we'll walk through an example case real quick, show some additional validation cases, and then briefly discuss some future work. Okay, so background on blastFoam. So as you can imagine, in the detonation community, there are not a ton of unrestricted and open source codes. So the reason for developing blastFoam was just that. We wanted an unrestricted, free, and open source solver or toolbox that you can actually see that it's verified and validated. We really wanted it to be used in research. We didn't want people to have to pay tens of thousands of dollars to be able to use the code to do research with, especially if you're learning this kind of stuff. It's really nice if you can actually kind of dig in and see the equations that are solved. And that just really wasn't available. So OpenFOAM was selected primarily because it's a great backbone to build anything on. It has parallel mesh generation, pre and post processing utilities, runtime controls. It's easy to integrate new libraries. It's very nice for doing what we wanted to do. And then obviously it has a good balance of usability, scalability, performance, and extensibility. It kind of balances all of those. And plus there's a ton of people working on it, which makes getting more development very easy, or development's easier. Yeah. Okay, so this is just kind of a brief walkthrough of where blastFoam has been. So blastFoam was originally presented at the OpenFOAM Users Conference in Germany in 2016, 2017. So this was the work by Peter. And this was a simple solver, used one equation a state. I believe it was based on row central foam. And it was specifically used for modeling detonations with the JWL equation of state, which I'll talk about in a little bit. I came on in October, of 2019. And that's when we had the first public release of blastFoam. Before that, blastFoam had kind of been an in-house project, used internally for cases, but that was about it. In March 2020, we released blastFoam 3. So there was some significant refactoring, just general improvements. We added integration with OpenFOAM's turbulence, some simple reaction models, radiation, different equation of states. blastFoam 3.5 was released in June 2020. Improved the thermodynamics. We added adaptive mesh refinement for 2D axisymmetric, as well as load balancing from Rettenmeier 2019. Had some additional function objects, started work on some multi-region type solvers. Then in November 2020, we released blastFoam 4. So this was really a focus on particles. So this was 2/multi-fluid model. So in the Euler-Euler sense, added support for Lagrangian particles, and then also optional coupling to OpenQBMM for quadrature-based moment methods. And then, so coming up, don't hold me to the date, blastFoam 5, we've been doing a lot of work, none of which has really been, it's not all quite ready yet. So blastFoam 5 will be based on OpenFOAM 8. There's going to be just a lot of general improvements. So we have a simple FSI solver in there right now. It is improved stability-wise. Some additional thermodynamic models, and really just a lot of like general improvements. A lot of behind-the-scenes stuff. Okay, so briefly talk about some of the governing equations, a little bit on blast theory. Mostly the models used, not so much the theory. So this will just be for the standard blastFoam solver. So we have the Euler-Euler solver as well, which we won't be talking about. Okay, so the governing equations. So these essentially break down to a time derivative of a conservative variable plus some flux, and you have some source term. So if you do single phase, you see the top here, you can neglect the species transport and you just get single phase compressible flow equations. When we do multi-phase or two-phase, we also have the addition of volume fraction. And then we have mass, or phase masses, so alpha rho. Other than that, these are essentially the same. The only difference is in the volume fraction transport. It's non-conservative, so we have this additional source term. And then we also have some optional sources for, it's a momentum source, so you can think of this like drag if you have particles. And then the energy source, which if you have heat transfer from particles, that would be what that is. Or when you have detonations, this is that energy addition, so sort of the heat of formation. And then we have our stress tensors, which are standard viscous stress tensors. Okay, so the model problem, which blastFoam is kind of our bread and butter, what we really solve, or what it was designed to solve. So you have a block of explosive material, and you detonate it at a point. So we assume that this detonation occurs at a single point, and then it propagates outwards at some prescribed detonation velocity. So this detonation velocity is very easy to find for most high explosive materials. I generally search like detonation velocity of C4. You can find it very quickly. It's probably the first pop-up on Google. So the reason we do this, one, it's a very simple model. So for engineering type simulations, it's quick, it's very easy. So we assume basically infinitely fast reaction kinetics, zero length scale. And this is done because so PBX is basically C4. But basically the resolution required is on the order of tenths of millimeters, which obviously if you're simulating either kilometers or at least tens to hundreds of meters, that's just not realistic. It's also not necessary. The simplified models do actually a very good job of accurately describing or reproducing what we see from test. So the simple models do a very good job. And we do have some more complex activation models. So basically the activation is just replaces all of that fast chemistry that occurs. And I'll talk about those in a second. So the reactants, the solid phase, this is going to be your unreacted explosive material. So as that, here we have a detonation wave. As that detonation wave passes, we have a transition to products. And basically the way in which we do, for example, pressure, both phases are represented by unique equations of states, and then we essentially blend them. So here, lambda is a reaction progress variable. PJWL will be the pressure of the product phase, and P solid will be the pressure of the unreacted reactants phase. And then lambda is between 0 and 1. So for the product gases, the most common equation of state used is the JWL or Jones-Wilkins-Lee. There are others, but it's definitely the most frequently used one. It's very well established for energetic materials, TNT, C4, PBX, that kind of stuff. And again, very easy to find. You can generally do a Google search and it'll come up very quickly. So here is the equation for pressure. You can see it's pretty complex. So E here is going to be your internal energy. And then V is specific volume. And then basically everything else is a model coefficient. So we have omega, A, R1, B, and R2. So there's a lot of parameters that you can modify. And again, they're pretty readily available. So then the last part of this is going to be air. So generally, we just assume that air is an ideal gas. It's a very simple model for the air. There are other equations of state that are available. So this is just kind of the general air burst type model setup. But say if you detonate it in water, you could use a stiffened gas equation of state or something along those lines. Okay, so the detonation model. It is basically, it handles that transition from solid materials to gaseous products. So we have those two states, the unreacted solid and the reacted product gases. And then we have the transition rates are determined by the model. So right now we have none, which basically means when you start the simulation, all of the energy is immediately released in all of the cells containing some energetic material. Next, we have the linear. So this is a detonation-based model, which is what we just kind of talked about, where you specify points that you want these waves to propagate from, and then they will propagate at the prescribed velocity and release energy as that wave passes cells. Next, we have pressure-based. So for this one, you actually have to initially react some cells, or if you do some sort of drop test or something like that, you need compression and or a higher pressure region. And basically, this uses the local pressure to begin the activation process. So when you get compression and high pressure in regions, that basically begins a runaway event, if you will, that just kind of propagates through the solid. And I have some rate stick simulations that I'll show, which illustrate this pretty well. Next, we have Arrhenius rate, which is temperature-based instead of pressure. And then there is the last model is it's called programmed ignition. It basically has two parts. So it has a simple compression-based part. So if you compress a material and you have a density higher than the reference density or the solid density, it will begin to activate. And then it also has a combination of a linear activation model. So it uses the detonation velocity as well. And then lastly, so those activation models take care of the primary detonation event. However, some cases there are afterburn, which are essentially reactions that occur after the primary detonation event and add additional energy to the system. So we have Miller, which is very similar to the pressure-based activation, which is just for additional energy. And we also have a linear release model. There's also none. Okay, so all of the detonation models use this same form, if you will. So we have this blending, which briefly talked about before. We have lambda. M is an optional exponent. It's typically 1. You can use some other value though. And then X is just whatever value you're blending. So if it's pressure, it's pressure. If it's speed of sound, speed of sound. And lambda is evolved based on transport plus some source term. So we have the mass-based transport of lambda equal to some reaction rate, where the reaction rate is determined by the model of choice. So for none, at the first time step, this is basically 1. And then after that, it's 0. For other ones, it takes a value between 0 and 1. Well, dt, I guess. And then so that energy source term, which we saw in the governing equations, this is actually how we define it. So we have alpha times rho E naught here is going to be the specific energy. So it's in dimensions of pressure. And then rho naught is going to be a reference density. So this basically returns the specific internal energy of activation. And then we multiply that by the time rate of change in lambda. Afterburn, we'll use the same equations. The only difference is you have a different form for the reaction rate, and you have a different value for energy here. But other than that, they're the same. Okay, so to actually use these detonation models, basically you have to define the thermodynamic model for both the reactants and the products. So unlike a standard multi-species where you define one equation of state with different coefficients, this is actually two separate equations of states. Like, they're not the same at all. So for the reactant phase, generally we use a solid equation of state. So something like the Murnaghan, we have the Birch-Murnaghan second and third order, solid JWL, which is really just the JWL with different coefficients. And then the Cochrane-Shan. So not all of these have super readily available coefficients, but you can. Generally speaking, if you're using either the no activation or the linear activation, the reactant equation of state doesn't really matter because there's no real movement before activation. But if you're looking at something and you're using a pressure-based equation of state, it is pretty important. And then lastly, we have the products. So this is the reactant product phase. And so we have the JWL-C form, which does not have contribution from internal energy. And then the LSEK, which is sort of a modified stiffened gas equation state. There's an exponent in, I believe it's density. Yeah, those are the available ones right now. Always working on more. Yeah. And then you have to specify the activation model and the afterburn model. So the afterburn model is optional. Yeah. Okay. So this part will just kind of be for anyone who's interested in, I guess, using blastFoam or developing with blastFoam. So it's just going to be kind of a brief walkthrough of the code structure. So hopefully, if anyone's interested in actually using this or using it to do something else, hopefully it'll be helpful. So because compressible flows lend itself very nicely to ODE time integration, the time integration system, the time integrator classes have been developed to do this. So basically what they are is they're runtime selectable classes that handle ODE time integration. So they basically determine variables need to be saved. So if you have like substeps and you need to save certain substeps, it'll do that for you. It'll, what I call blend. So basically, if you need to combine the first state and the second state with some coefficients, it'll do that for you. It'll handle changes in cell volumes from moving meshes. So it'll do all that. And basically, that's all determined by the specific ODE which you choose. And then the ODE systems determine basically, what are your changes due to certain variables and how do they change. So to derive new systems, basically you need an update and a solve function. So update is anything that is done, needs to be done before anything is solved. So it has to be done using the old state. And then solve updates your values. And that's really it. So right now we have the Euler method, RK2, RK2 SSP, RK3 SSP, RK4, and RK4 SSP. And then we also have some additional variations for the strong stability preserving or SSP schemes. So you can specify an optional additional number of steps. So for example, the RK2 SSP has 2-step, 3-steps, and 4-step variations. And really what those are used for is they have the more steps you do, generally speaking, for these at least, the higher Courant number you can use and still be stable. Still not recommended to use greater than 1. But it's good that way. If you go slightly above 1, it doesn't crash immediately, which can happen sometimes. Yeah. And then all of this is just selected at runtime, basically in the same way in which you select your time derivative schemes. Next, we have the thermodynamic classes. So this has kind of been updated as we have gone. It's fallen much more in line with the standard OpenFOAM thermodynamic classes, if you've had the pleasure of looking through those. So there's essentially a couple levels. So you have a species, an equation of state, a thermodynamic model, and a transport model. The main differences here, so all of ours are density-based as opposed to pressure-based, which has some challenges with it, at least in terms of the coding. However, we can use either internal energy or temperature-based equations of state. So generally, the internal energy is considered the Micro-Nyssen form, or at least that's what I consider it. And then temperature-based is, standard PV equals nRT. That kind of form where it's an explicitly dependent upon temperature. Currently, right now, in the master branch on GitHub, there are no mixtures. Mostly this is because our problem of interest, which we just talked about, is a multi-phase, not a multi-species problem. So we didn't have any need for multi-species. That will be available with the upcoming release. There still won't be any reactions. Those are a little bit harder, at least to use the standard OpenFOAM ones. But mixtures will be there. Okay, so the available equations of state, as I mentioned, the Micro-Nyssen form, which are internal energy-based equations of state. These use a constant CP-CV ratio. So it's your standard ideal gas. Next, we have the stiffened gas equation of state, the Tate equation of state. Those two are very similar. Then we have the van der Waals equation of state, JWL, which we talked about, Cochran-Chan, LSEK, and then Dewan-Nickel. The Dewan-Nickel is a very complicated way to describe air at very high temperatures and pressures. It reduces to an ideal gas in atmospheric conditions, but it is you can handle much higher pressures, and then always working on more here. But next we have the temperature base, so the BKW, which is still very experimental. It's a temperature-based explosive equation of state. The Murnaghan equation of state, Birch-Murnaghan, mentioned, BWR, experimental. I think it's cubic in temperature, cubic in density, I believe. Abel-Nobel equation of state, which is generally used for propellants. And then perfect gas, which is going to be the standard OpenFOAM perfect gas. So this allows for variable CP-CV ratios based on the molecular weight. So the Micro-Nyssen, generally speaking, the Micro-Nyssen equations of state do not really use molecular weight at all. They're all based on gamma. The temperature-based ones, however, are all based on the molecular weight. Just kind of a note for running simulations. And then lastly, we have a tabulated equation of state. So hopefully it's a very general implementation, and it's used for real gases where you don't have an explicit form of pressure. So basically it uses a two-dimensional lookup table for pressure and temperature, pressure and temperature based on internal energy and density. So this has been very well validated, works pretty well. Yeah, so it's, if anyone's familiar, you can basically use Sesame tables and just read those in. Okay. And then lastly, I'll answer, there's a couple questions coming in. I'll answer questions at the end, unless they are directly related to, I guess, the current slides. So the thermal model is kind of just the general thermodynamic model for it. So there's a couple different levels. So again, very similar to OpenFOAM. We have a basic thermo model. Next, we have E-thermo or a blended thermo. So this is kind of where it's a little bit different. So the E-thermo is similar to HE-thermo. It basically uses the specified equation of state, thermodynamic, and transport model to get all your fields. The blended thermo model actually uses two of those and does the blending. So those are kind of two options. And then we also have one step higher than that. We have either the fluid model or the solid model. There are, at least for the fluid phases, there are single phase and multi-phase variations. And then individual phases are selected, or runtime selectable. So this is either like a basic, which is a not detonating material, or a detonating material. And then, so basically all of this is responsible for handling the calculation of thermodynamic or shared thermodynamic variables. So pressure, speed of sound, specific heats, that kind of stuff. Okay, so then we have our compressible system. So this is where like the actual compressible part comes in. So this is a time integration system. So basically it's responsible for transporting conservative variables, so mass, momentum, and energy, and then it also converts them to primitive variables, so density, velocity, internal energy, and pressure. So the standard blastFoam solver assumes that you have one velocity. So if you have multiple phases, this is the shared velocity, and a single internal energy or temperature. So again, it's shared between all the phases. The number of phases and therefore the exact type of compressible system you use is determined by the number of names or phase names which you provide in the phase properties. Turbulence is included if the viscosity is not zero. So if you specify zero viscosity, it just won't even use a turbulence model. And then we also have optional radiation models. So these are pretty similar to the standard OpenFOAM radiation. The main difference is we use an explicit solution method. And there's also an ODE solver, which can be used to relax temperature and radiation. Or sorry, I guess it just relaxes radiation if the global time stepping is not stable. So if you have really strong radiation, you can use an ODE solver to reach equilibrium. Right now, we have a pretty limited selection of the models. A lot of it's based on the OpenFOAM thermodynamics, which we just currently don't have a lot of what they do. So things like absorption models aren't all there, but a lot of it is. All right, last part. So flux schemes. So we have runtime selectable flux schemes. So we have a lot of the standard ones, HLL, HLC, AOSM plus, AOSM plus UP, which is essentially just a low speed correction term, has a low speed correction term. And then the Kurganov and Tadmor, which are row central foam. So these have no dependencies on any of the other classes presented. Basically, you provide these with your density, velocity, pressure, and internal energy, speed of sound, and it will return your conservative fluxes. So this means if you want to use part of blastFoam to do something, you can without having to include all the thermodynamics and all that stuff. So you can use the cubic interpolators with limiters for higher order solutions. So just like the standard OpenFOAM cubic interpolation. And we also have implemented upwind, linear, and quadratic Musil reconstruction, so true Musil reconstruction. And that uses the limiters as well. And then we also have a new Riemann flux scheme. So basically what the purpose of this is to use explicit fluxes within the FEM div term, since we don't solve any matrices. This makes advection explicit, and it allows for higher order advection of things that OpenFOAM does that we don't have control over. So it'll use the fluxes that are created with the flux scheme, and it'll do high order reconstruction if you want of the specific variables with which you're transporting. Turbulence terms can kind of overpower advection since they're implicit. So you can get some weird stuff where advection seems to go away. Just a note if it looks weird if you're using it. Okay, so then some additional features. So the adaptive mesh refinement, we ported or incorporated the work of Rettmeyer et al. 2019, I believe it was blastFoam 3.5, a little bit ago. And this added 2D axisymmetric, and load balancing. So this is obviously huge. Compressible flow, adaptive mesh refinement is very important, especially to resolve shocks and not resolve everything else. So we have our specific adaptive FE mesh class is really a modified version of the dynamic refined balance FE mesh class by Rettmeyer. However, it's very specific for blastFoam / compressible flows in general. So instead of having to specify a field which you track, you specify an error estimator. So this error estimator could be a field if you wanted to. We also have a couple different options. So density gradient, you can look at the change across a face for a given field. So basically owner minus neighbor values. And then smoothness. We also have improved compatibility with snappy hex mesh. So, if cells are cut from snappy, you keep that refinement history. You can't unrefine it, but it still works. And then it does work somewhat well with snapping as well. There's a couple corner cases which it does fail, but for the most part, it works fairly well. And then the mesh refinement method. So if you do 2D axisymmetric, or 3D, 1D is not currently implemented. It's determined by the mesh. So you don't actually have to specify which one you want to use. And then lastly, we have moving adaptive FE mesh, which is exactly what it sounds like. It is the adaptive mesh plus mesh movements. So this is good for things like fluid structure interaction or just general moving meshes. This will be much better with the next release. There's been a fair amount of work done with this. Yeah. All right, we have some additional function objects that really are just kind of quality of life kind of things. So we have some blast specific ones. So impulse, overpressure, dynamic pressure, speed of sound, and time of arrival. So these are really just to save or reduce the number of calculators which need to be made in ParaView. I mean, overpressure is pressure minus a reference value, and that's it. It's just easy to have. And then we also have some general function objects. So write time list, basically, if you provide a list of times at which you want to write at, and it will write at exactly those. So it's useful if you're comparing basically to some experimental results and they have some weird times, which they give you snapshots for, you can write explicitly at those times. Next, the field max. So the field max is, what it does is, even if you're using adaptive mesh refinement, it tracks the maximum value you see in every cell. So when unrefinement occurs, generally speaking, the cells are averaged, so your maximum value will actually reduce or can reduce. And this basically will keep whatever the maximum value in the original cells was. So that'll expand, but you'll get the true maximum value. Tracer particles, just standard trace particles. And then we also have some improved probes. Again, quality of life type stuff. So for us, we had a lot of cases where we were given a list of probes and they were like just barely outside the mesh, like maybe a millimeter. And, we just wanted to move them slightly inside. Generally, you have to do this by hand. And if you have hundreds of probes, it's terrible. So this will basically just find the closest cell and move it to that location. And then it can also append to the end of existing probes. So this is good if you want to restart a case, rather than writing a new time folder and a new probe, which you then later have to merge. This will just automatically do that. Yeah. And then we have set refine fields. So I think this is my favorite little utility we have. Basically what it does is it iterates over cell sets to refine volumes. So you can set different, it's a modified version of set fields. So it'll use, you can refine these different cell sets, different levels if you want. You can define multiple fields, which basically you want to track to see where there's changes. There are backup areas, which are very useful. Basically, it'll expand the region in which you want to search to refine cells. So if you have like a 1 millimeter charge and your base mesh is a meter, you can expand this backup region. So it'll capture cells until it basically refines enough to catch the volume you want. It'll never set that backup region. And then it's compatible with 2D axisymmetric, and 3D meshes. And right now, there's been, again, some more work done on this, but right now you can use some initial field as a default field value. So basically a non-uniform field it'll store that field and then reset it to the original field and continue. That way you just set what you actually want. So this is useful, for example, with like an atmosphere. Next, we have coupling with precise. So if you don't know, precise is it acts as a middleman between two solvers. So for example, if you want to go between OpenFOAM and a solid mechanics solver, either say like BL2 or Calculix, precise acts as that kind of intermediary and will send data back and forth. So we use, blastFoam is ready to use with the OpenFOAM adapter. So here we can use that adaptive moving mesh, which I talked about. Interface boundaries, so anywhere where precise needs to be sending and receiving data, those cannot be refined or balanced. So this must be done by specifying protected patches. You do this in the dynamic mesh dict. And you also can't currently use balancing. These are both precise limitations. Basically, they can't update the mapping between regions or solvers, whatever you want to call it, while it's running. So this is done once at the beginning and then not again. So if the OpenFOAM mesh changes, it'll crash. Here's just kind of an example case. So you can see we can use adaptive mesh refinement. It's just that wall can't be refined. So you can refine it up to the maximum level and then just force it to stay there. Okay, so then just kind of a quick overview of the solvers. We've been adding more. So blastFoam is the main solver. It handles single phase and multi-phase, you know, as long as you have that single shared velocity and internal energy. So all of the functionality that I just talked about is presented here. You don't have to do anything different for it. You don't have to include any libraries or anything like that. The dynamic mesh classes can all be used. You just have to specify the dynamic mesh dict or include it. So this means that adaptive mesh refinement's there. You have the moving meshes. You don't have to include libraries for sampling like you typically do with OpenFOAM. They're just there. So next we have blastFoam. So these are kind of the solvers we didn't talk about. So blastFoam is the Euler-Euler multi-phase solver. So right now only a single fluid phase can be used. It gets multiple fluid phases get weird because you have to equilibrate pressure. Yeah, it's weird. So right now you can only use one fluid phase. However, you can use an arbitrary number of solid phases. So this means that if you want 3 different particle sizes, you can do that. So you can basically think of this as a very compressible version of multi-phase Euler foam. It doesn't have everything it does. There's no population balance models or, well, a lot of the stuff it has, but the basic stuff is there. So we have a lot of the interfacial models. So drag, virtual mass lift, mass transfer is currently under development. We have kinetic theory models. These are different than OpenFOAM because they do account for all solid phases. So there's basically pair interactions as well as a cumulative effect of all the solid phase. So alpha solid, not alpha solid 1, 2, and 3. And all of this is based on, at least the compressible side, it's based on the work of Huim and Iran from 2016. I'll refer to them later in the validation cases as well. So then just kind of some additional solvers. So these have not all been thoroughly validated, but they are there in kind of an experimental capacity. So we have blast multi-region foam, which is basically a modified version of CTH multi-region foam, which is compressible. Blast FSI. So this uses blastFoam. There's been some work for what I call mapped moving patches. So rather than just a map patch, basically it has a displacement field associated with it. So displacement foam does not actually move the mesh, it just tracks the displacement field, and we use that displacement field to basically calculate the mapping. Currently working on coupling it with solids for foam. So this would basically allow for things like plastic deformation. The same methodology would be used. It would just be the solids that are solved are different. Then we have blast foam, blast reacting foam, which are modified or compressible versions of psi and reacting foam. Blast partial foam is a 2-way coupled particle solver. I'm using the Lagrangian particle classes, and then optional open QBMM solvers. So this is basically a dispersed phase based on quadrature phase moment methods. Okay, so just kind of a quick run through of actually running a blastFoam case. So initial conditions, so this is all very standard to OpenFOAM. So you need pressure, density, temperature, volume fraction if you're using 2 or multiple phases. Within the constant files, you need phase properties. So this also includes the thermodynamic classes, as well as a list of phases. The dynamic mesh dict is optional. If you want to use adaptive mesh refinement or a moving mesh, you just have to include this dictionary and give the necessary entries. Turbulence properties is only required if your viscosity is not 0. And then we have system files, controlled FE schemes, FE solution, and then set fields dict if you want. Okay, so this case is going to be, it's called the Kingery-Bullmash equations is what we're going to be comparing to. So basically these are experimentally fit equations based on a hemispherical 10 kilogram charge of TNT on the ground. So we're going to be using an axisymmetric wedge. It'll be 16 by 16 meters. The base mesh is going to be 0.32 meters. And then we're going to be using adaptive mesh. So the initial conditions, so the level set in set fields is going to be 5 millimeters or level 6. And then while we're running, our maximum refinement is going to be of level 4, about 20 millimeters. And then this is going to be using the linear activation model. Okay, so this is kind of a long file, mostly just going to point out some stuff. So at the top, you can see, the phases here. So basically we're specifying 2 phases. If you were to specify 3, you would just have to describe or give the model coefficients for that 3rd phase and include the necessary initial conditions. So we're going to be having TNT and air. The first phase, you'll need a volume fraction for. That's just the way it's defined. So for TNT, you can see we're specifying a detonating material. And then we have 2 entries here. So we have our reactants and we also have our products. So the reactants are going to be your solid phase. So we're going to be using the Murnaghan equation of state, reference density of 1,630, gamma, which is basically 1 minus specific heat ratio. It's not exactly what it is, but it's close. K naught 0, and then a reference pressure of basically standard atmosphere. This basically results in just a constant pressure. So it ends up just being a reference pressure for the solid phase. Molecular weight is defined, but it's not really used. We're going to be doing an inviscid simulation. Thermodynamics, we're specifying our heat capacity and our heat of formation. And that's all we need for the reactants. For the product phases, it's basically the same, except we're going to be using the JWL equation of state. So here you can see, again, we have our model coefficients. So rho naught, A, B, R1, R2, and omega. Again, these are pretty easy to find for most common explosives. And then, so the rest of that's going to be the same. And then lastly, since we're using a detonating model, we have this activation model entry. And then the initiation subdictionary. So here, for all of the activation models, we need to specify E naught or the detonation energy. Again, this is a pressure. This is what it's basically always given. And so it's not like this is a value which you might not be able to get. So this is basically always given in pressure, generally in gigapascals. And then we specify our points at which we want to detonate from. So if you wanted to do a multi-point detonation, it would basically advance waves from multiple points. And then we specify our detonation velocity. Residual alpha and residual rho are basically just helpers to make sure we don't divide by 0. So air, so this is gonna, sorry, final phase, air. We're just gonna be using an ideal gas. So gamma of 1.4 standard air. Next, we have the dynamic mesh stick. So here we're going to be specifying, we're going to be using the adaptive FE mesh class with a density gradient error estimator. So basically this will just tell you where you have high gradients density, and it will update accordingly or mark the error cells accordingly. We're going to be refining every 3 steps. Load balancing, so this is an optional entry. I believe these are the optional or the default entries as well. So if you don't include this, it'll just do it by default. So balance, yes, you can also specify it outside. This is an optional dictionary as well as an optional entry, as well as optional entries. So this balance interval is how many refinement steps you take between balances. So this is, you can do 10 times the refine interval, basically. So every 30 steps it'll refine. Allowable imbalance will be the maximum deviation from mean as a percent. And then so method here, if by default it'll use the method you specify in decompose partict, but you can also specify other methods here. And then we have lower refine level. So this is the error at which it will unrefine. Or sorry, stop refining. Then we have the unrefined level, so the level at which it will actually unrefine. The number of buffer layers. So this is slightly different than the normal refine FE mesh, I think is what it is. So their buffer cell or buffer layers just mark cells which won't be unrefined. This buffer layer will actually refine cells within that buffer layer. So if you have error in a cell, it'll actually refine 2 cells in each direction, even if they're not marked as errors. And that is actually why we use this, why we refine every 3 steps, just because theoretically, if you use a current number of 0.5, you'd have 4 time steps before your shock could reach the boundary. So basically it just refines how often you have to refine, which can save a fair amount of time. And then we have our maximum refinement, which is 4. So 2 to the 4th, or sorry, dx divided by 2 to the 4th. Okay, now we have our FE schemes. So specify the Flux scheme, which is going to be the Kurganov. We have done a fair amount of playing with these different schemes. The Kurganov and Tadmor seem to work best for spherical charges. Some of the other ones, you get some non-spherical shape effects that kind of happen. But these seem to do a very good job of keeping everything spherical. Then we have our time integrator scheme. So this is actually the time integrator, which we're going to use the ODE solver. So this is going to be a 4-step RK2 SSP scheme. Gradient schemes. So these are really used for the Musil reconstruction. Generally, you want to use cell MD limited. It can actually fail pretty quickly if you just use like least squares or something. The cell MD limited is actually pretty important. Then in the divergence schemes here, you can see for the divergence of mass flux and reaction progress variable, we're going to be using Riemann. So basically, we want to keep our advection scheme consistent between this lambda and then mass, momentum, and energy. Lastly, we have our interpolation schemes here. So default is cubic. It's not really used, I don't think. But then these reconstructions, we're going to be using the linear Musil with the Van Albada limiter. And here, so usually you have to specify a V, basically to say to limit directions independently for like velocity or something. That's done by default for all of these, so you don't have to do that. It's just a scalar limiter because it does components individually. So for the functions within the control dict, so these are just kind of an example of how you specify ours. So impulse, give it the right control as well as a reference pressure. That's it. Overpressure, you have this optional storage, which basically means don't calculate it, write it, and then delete it. Actually write it or add it to the database so you can use it later. Impulse, that's done by default just because it's an integration over all time. So you kind of have to. So this max P and impulse, which this is actually why we store overpressure. So we want to basically track the maximum values of overpressure and impulse over all times. And then we're just looking at the overpressure and impulse fields. And then lastly, we have time of arrival. And this is basically just says when, at what time is the maximum overpressure reached. So if the overpressure at the next step is higher, it'll use that time. If not, we'll use the previous. All right, so last file, we have set fields dict. So set fields dict can be used with so the set refined fields dict that's used with set refined fields can be used with set fields as well. So if you like, I don't really want to refine it, then you can just use the standard set fields and it's fine. Just a note. So here we specify the fields. So basically these are the fields in which you're going to be tracking changes. So you can also specify an error estimator here if you want. But by default, basically it just says, is there any change over across the cell face? If yes, refine it. Number of buffer layers. So basically how many cells we want to have on either side of that boundary. So default field values here, this is actually pretty important. So basically when it iterates over that set, refine, set, refine, set, refine process, after each refinement, it'll reset the default field values. And this is just so you start with a clean slate and you're actually setting what you want to set. If you don't do this, it'll basically just continue to set on top of that original shape, which could be bad. So here you can also, this is where you can specify, I believe it's a vol scalar field init val. If you want to save that original field and use that to reset. So it'll map and interpolate those values. In the next release, there'll be some other things here that you can do, like functions, which are pretty cool. And then lastly, we have the regions. So here, same as set fields, you specify regions which you want to set. So here we're using the sphere to cell shape. Specify a center and a radius. So that part's normal. And then we also have this backup region. So basically what this is we're saying, I don't think this one would catch it. So I won't, no cell will see 0.1, or sorry, no cell will see 0, 0, 0 at the cell center within the radius of 0.143. So we're going to expand the region which we're searching and basically add those cells, refine them. And then as we get cells that are actually within this volume, it'll stop using that backup cell and just continue setting and refining using the new, or the correct one. This refine internal flag basically means, do I want to refine all the cells or do I just want to refine the cells on the boundary where there's changes? And then level. So level is how many levels of refinement. So each of these cell shapes can have different levels. And lastly, we have the field values. So the value you want to set the field. So this is what it gives. So this is very zoomed in. As you can see, so this is one original cell. Basically, for it to set any cells, it has to set the cell center. And as you can see, it would not have made it. But it's continued to refine down, and you only actually have 3 cells which are refined. And I think in the master you can do it. There's a debug flag you can use when you run set refine fields if you want to see the intermediate steps. It's kind of cool. You can watch it refine down if you're interested. Lastly, or sorry, not lastly, so now we have some results. So basically we have this detonation, we get the primary wave, and you'll notice you have a bunch of like secondary waves. Basically what happens is you get collapses due to like, it basically overexpands and then it collapses on itself, and then you get high pressure again, and you get another shock wave, which is why you get these different rings basically. And then, so on the bottom here, you can see we have our maximum overpressure in comparison with the equations, as well as impulse and time of arrival. That's pretty well. All right, so then really just some additional validation cases. Just kind of examples of what we have done, some of what we have done so far with blastFoam. These are really just validation of the main solvers and their main functionalities. So we have some single phase validation cases, multi-phase, so that's shared velocity and energy. And then we also have some gas solid. All right, so the first case, the standard solid shock tube, density on the left, 1, density on the right of 0.25. And then we have pressure differential of, or factor of 10. Again, match well. Next, we have the set-off blast wave. So this is essentially a point source detonation, or point source of pressure. And we're using an ideal gas here. And then these are compared to the results of set-off from 1959. This is an analytical solution. So the pressure, the initial pressure within a radius delta R is defined by this equation here, where gamma is the specific heat. Forgot to look up what E was. D is the number of dimensions, and that delta R is going to be basically the radius which you're going to set. So you can see we match really well. It's a really sharp peak. It's hard to get. Yeah, so this 2D is a wedge, 3D is a sector. These are both 1D cases. It's just the 2D and 3D. So cylinder and sphere, basically. Next, we have a 2D case. So this is a 2D Riemann problem where we have quadrants of velocity, density, and pressure. See, it expands, and then you can see comparisons with us. So the top right is us, contoured, not zoomed in. And then you have the bottom, which is just a nice zoomed in, refined version of this. I believe the video will be uploaded. Sandra, that's right, correct? I believe the video will be uploaded. It's being recorded. Next, we have, so moving on to the multi-phase, we have a 2-fluid shock tube. So on one side, we have a stiffened gas equation of state of water. On the left, right, we had gas using the van der Waals equation of state. So on the left, we have a pressure of 1 gigapascal and a density of 1,000. And then on the right, we have a density of 50 and a pressure of basically 1 atmosphere. Comparisons of velocity and pressure. Lastly, we have for the shared velocity energy multi-phase. So we have some rate stick simulations. So here, basically what's happening is the bottom is being hit with some velocity, and that's causing compression and therefore high pressures and densities, and that begins the activation process. So you can see it hits, it starts, and then it begins to continue to react. So the velocity at which that wave moves once it kind of reaches equilibrium is considered the detonation velocity. So you can see this JWL++ model uses the JWLC form, as well as the Murnaghan equation of state, and then the pressure-based activation model. So you can see we match very well with the blue dots of the experimental data, basically right in line. And then the black dots here are some additional simulation results. So for a rate stick, this clearly you end up getting a linear relation with detonation velocity based on the inverse radius. So you can see that you automatically have shape effects based on what you're using. So if you have interesting shapes for your charge, the pressure base will more accurately represent the way in which this wave moves through your material and actually reacts and releases energy. Okay, so next. Yes, sorry, going back to the question, the recording of the session will be available in the platform next week. You should have been informed from email. So the last section will be for gas particle flows. So here, this is just going to be a dilute shock tube. So this is, you can think of it really just as a test of drag on particles. So the initial particle volume fraction of 5e⁻⁴. We have a pressure differential of 10. And then compared to the work of Huimeron from 2016. So we have the dimensionless density as well as pressure here. These match very well. Next, we have a dense gas solid shock tube. So this is packing. This is where a lot of interesting stuff begins to happen. So you have things like granular viscosity, frictional pressure, and so generally in incompressible flows, you assume that the heat released from inelastic collisions is zero. Here, that is not necessarily true. So all of that stuff is incorporated into this test. So the initial particle volume fraction is going to be 0.4, and we're going to have a pressure differential of 100. So stronger shock than before. Again, this is compared to Huimeron 2016. This one is not quite as clean as the last one, but you can see we still match pretty well with pressure. We have velocity, temperature, and density. And then I also have, good idea. So here you can see that as that shock tube progresses, you start to pack the particles. You can also see that here in the density. So you basically hit this wall, which is at 0.65% volume fraction. And it just can't go any higher just because it's fully packed. So you have wave speed propagation through that material. So you have basically speed of sound or wave propagation speed within the solid itself. Analogous to speed of sound in air, it's just different. Yeah, these are fun. Lastly, we have a bidisperse case. So this is just, again, a simple test of basically drag. Everything else works for it. This is just really the only one we have good validation for. So this is compared to the work of Lay et al. From 2018, sorry. So this is a shock wave with a Mach number of 1.4. And then we have diameters of 80 and 11 micrometers, and then volume fractions of 2.6, e to the minus 4. So here you can see, I'm sorry, this is 0.5 milliseconds, 1 millisecond, and 2 milliseconds, I believe. So here you can see they start right on top of each other, and then the small particles begin to accelerate faster. You're out of order. Begin to accelerate faster and spread out more. You can also see the velocity increases much faster for the smaller particles. Okay, so just kind of closing notes. So where to get help? So if you have questions about what exactly the models do, I think I have everything in the user guide. I believe all of the the possible model coefficients and possible model options are included in there as well. So if some things there are default values for which you can change, all of that is included in the user guide, as well as the equation solved. So if you're wondering what we do, it's there. You can always email us at info@synthetictechnologies.com. We do custom private workshops and trainings if it's something you're interested in. Bugs, submit them to the GitHub issue page. And if you're looking for something new, definitely contact us. We're always looking for community suggestions. Kind of depends. I like to add new things. Kind of depends if I have time. But always looking for input. So future plans, as I mentioned, I've been working a lot on solid mechanics / fluid structure interaction, looking a lot at solids for foam. Would be much better than just the standard linear elastic, especially because detonations generally don't fall in that regime. Immersed boundary method for rigid body motion. This is kind of currently set up like a function object. And it's also hopefully going to be, can right now. You can use it with some solid models as well. So basically you can have immersed multi-regions where the boundaries are enforced with immersed boundary method. And then also looking at porting to some different OpenFOAM variations. So OpenFOAM v2012 as well as Blue CFD. Yeah. Here are all the references used for this presentation, and then questions. So I will start going through. It's on there. Oh, turn my camera too. Sorry, I forgot to turn that on earlier. So I guess starting at the bottom, propulsion applications as far as rockets or that kind of thing. No, not really. Rate sticks would probably be the most applicable. We are doing work with propellants though, which I have been told is very similar. Yeah, so we've been doing a lot of work with that recently for propellants as far as mass transfer and different grains and that kind of thing. Method is used. So what method is used to interpolate from tabulated thermo values, example, multidimensional area volume averaging? How do you handle potential out of range values? So we do standard linear interpolation. However, you can also basically use different spaces, if you will. So for example, you can use log spacing or exponential spacing or power 10, that kind of thing. So for the data we've used in the past, we use logarithmic spacing, natural log spacing for pressure, and log 10 spacing for density, I believe. And then out of bounds, I don't remember how it's currently implemented. We had gone back and forth a little bit on this, whether or not to extrapolate or not. I believe blastFoam is currently set up so it hard limits based on the values you have. I don't remember if it warns or not. Yeah. Hopefully the tables are complete, or I guess is expansive enough as you need. Yeah, we don't have any other sort of interpolation currently, though. Are the cell MD limited grad scheme and the linear Musil interpolation scheme both used for the same thing, Musil, or are they different things? So they are different things. So basically, the gradient schemes are how the gradients are constructed, which are used in the Musil reconstruction schemes. So basically, it's cell value plus gradient of cell value, or gradient at cell, will give you basically the upwinding and downwinding reconstruction. So it basically just makes sure that your gradients aren't huge. So you're not over predicting, essentially. Last one was very interesting, impressive. Wish I knew about it in my PhD. Would you be interested in contributing to a tutorial to the tutorial collection? Sure. I guess I don't know which one. Feel free to send us an email, or I'd be happy to talk after as well. Any other questions? Well, I guess we will end it now. Feel free to shoot us an email if you have any questions. Thank you everyone for coming.